Hello everyone, I'm Nora Flynn, and today we're diving into one of the most explosive transatlantic tech confrontations of our time. What started as a regulatory fine has erupted into a full-scale diplomatic clash that's testing the limits of digital sovereignty and reshaping US-Europe relations. If you want to stay informed about the biggest geopolitical stories shaping our world, make sure to subscribe to Nora Flynn and hit that notification bell so you never miss our deep dive documentaries. On December 5th, 2025, the European Union dropped a bombshell. The European Commission announced it was fining Elon Musk's social media platform X 120 million euros, equivalent to roughly $140 million. This wasn't just another corporate penalty. It was the first enforcement action under Europe's landmark Digital Services Act, a sweeping regulation designed to hold big tech accountable. The announcement sent shockwaves through Silicon Valley and triggered an unprecedented response from Washington. Within days, American political leaders were condemning the fine as an attack on free speech. Within 3 weeks, the United States government had imposed travel bans on 5 European officials and activists. What makes this confrontation so significant is not just the money involved. It's the fundamental clash of visions about who should control the digital public square. Brussels sees itself as a regulator protecting citizens from deceptive practices and harmful content. Washington sees European regulation as censorship disguised as consumer protection. And caught in the middle are hundreds of millions of users on both continents who rely on these platforms for news, debate, and connection. This is the story of how a transparency fine became a geopolitical flashpoint. To understand this crisis, we need to go back to 2022. That's when the European Union passed the Digital Services Act, one of the most comprehensive tech regulations ever created. The DSA was designed to address a growing problem. Social media platforms had become enormously powerful, shaping public opinion, spreading information and misinformation, and influencing elections. Yet they operated with minimal oversight and almost no transparency. The European Commission, led by President Ursula von der Leyen, decided this had to change. The Digital Services Act established strict obligations for what Europe calls very large online platforms. These are platforms with more than 45 million monthly users in the EU. X, formerly known as Twitter, easily qualified. Under the DSA, these platforms must be transparent about their content moderation decisions. They must provide clear information about advertising. They must give researchers access to public data so independent experts can study the platform's societal impact. And they must avoid what the law calls deceptive design practices, interfaces that trick users into making choices they wouldn't otherwise make. The law was ambitious and unprecedented. It applied uniformly across all 27 EU member states, creating a single set of rules for the world's largest single market. Violators could face fines of up to 6% of their global annual revenue. For a company like X, which is part of Elon Musk's business empire that includes Tesla and SpaceX, that could theoretically mean billions of dollars in penalties. The European Commission made clear from the start that it intended to enforce these rules vigorously. In December 2023, the Commission opened a formal investigation into X. The focus was on 3 specific areas of concern. First, the platform's use of blue checkmarks. Second, its advertising transparency. And third, access for researchers. For nearly 2 years, investigators gathered evidence, requested information from the company, and built their case. By July 2024, preliminary findings indicated that X had violated multiple transparency obligations. Elon Musk's response was defiant rather than conciliatory. He rejected offers to settle the case by making voluntary changes. Instead, he indicated he would fight any penalties in court. The heart of the European Commission's case was the blue checkmark. For years on Twitter, that little blue badge meant something specific. It meant the platform had verified that an account belonged to who it claimed to be. Journalists, politicians, celebrities, and public figures displayed blue checks as proof of authenticity. Users could trust that when they saw that symbol, they were reading posts from the real person, not an impersonator or fake account. But in 2022, after Elon Musk purchased Twitter and rebranded it as X, everything changed. Musk eliminated the old verification system entirely. Instead, he made the blue checkmark available to anyone willing to pay $8 per month for X Premium. The company no longer verified identity. They didn't check whether subscribers were who they claimed to be. They simply collected payment and granted the badge. To Musk, this was democratization. He argued that the old system had created a digital aristocracy where elite voices were amplified while ordinary people were ignored. His new approach put everyone on equal footing. But European regulators saw something very different. They saw deception. When users encountered a blue-checked account, they still assumed it was verified in the traditional sense. That misunderstanding created serious risks. Scammers could buy blue checks and impersonate legitimate organizations, defrauding unsuspecting victims. Political misinformation could spread more easily when fake accounts appeared authentic. The symbol that once signaled trust now meant nothing more than someone had paid a subscription fee. According to the European Commission, this violated Article 25 of the Digital Services Act. That provision prohibits deceptive design practices, sometimes called dark patterns. These are interface choices that manipulate users into decisions they wouldn't make if they had complete information. In the Commission's view, X's blue checkmark was exactly that. It exploited user expectations to create a false sense of authenticity. The company knew people associated blue checks with verification, yet they continued using the symbol while completely changing what it meant. This wasn't just bad design. European regulators argued it was deliberate deception that put users at risk. The blue checkmark was the most visible violation, but it wasn't the only one. The European Commission also found that X had failed to maintain a functional advertising repository. Under the Digital Services Act, platforms must create searchable databases where anyone can see what advertisements are running, who paid for them, and what targeting criteria were used. This transparency is considered essential for accountability. It helps journalists investigate political influence campaigns. It allows researchers to study advertising practices. It gives citizens insight into who is trying to persuade them and how. X did create an advertising archive, but European investigators found it severely inadequate. The database was difficult to search. Critical information about advertisers was often missing. Data about how ads were targeted to specific demographics was incomplete or unavailable. In some cases, advertisements simply weren't included in the repository at all. Other major platforms, including Meta and Google, had implemented far more comprehensive systems. X's repository was so dysfunctional that it essentially defeated the purpose of transparency. Users and researchers couldn't effectively study advertising on the platform. The third violation involved research access. The Digital Services Act requires platforms to provide qualified researchers with access to publicly available data. This allows independent experts to study important questions. How do recommendation algorithms work? Does the platform amplify certain types of content? Are there patterns in how misinformation spreads? These questions have major implications for democracy and public health, but answering them requires data that only the platforms possess. X's terms of service explicitly prohibited researchers from independently accessing public data, even through standard techniques like web scraping. The company created barriers that made it nearly impossible for eligible researchers to obtain the information they needed. Other obstacles included excessive fees, complex application processes, and arbitrary restrictions on what data could be analyzed. European regulators concluded that X was systematically blocking the research access that European law guaranteed. Taken together, these three violations showed a pattern. X was avoiding the transparency and accountability that the Digital Services Act demanded. On December 5, 2025, European Commission Executive Vice President Henna Virkkunen announced the decision at a press conference in Brussels. X would pay a fine of €120 million for violating the Digital Services Act. This marked the first time the Commission had imposed financial penalties under the landmark regulation. The amount represented a careful calculation. Under the DSA, fines can reach up to 6% of a company's global annual revenue. For Musk's business empire, that theoretical maximum could have meant billions. But the Commission emphasized that their goal wasn't punishment for its own sake. They wanted compliance. Commissioner Virkkunen stated that if companies follow the rules, they don't get fined. It's that simple. The €120 million penalty was designed to be proportionate. Regulators considered three factors. First, the nature of the violations. These were transparency failures rather than more serious harms like promoting illegal content. Over the future of free expression online. Second, the gravity in terms of affected users. X has over 100 million monthly users in the European Union. And third, the duration of the infractions. X had been in violation for well over a year, despite multiple warnings. European officials made clear that the fine was significantly lower than it could have been. This was partly strategic. A massive penalty might have been seen as punitive overreach, confirming American accusations that Brussels was targeting U.S. companies. A more measured fine sent a different message. The EU was enforcing its laws seriously, but proportionately. Commission spokesman Thomas Regnier explicitly contrasted X's approach with that of TikTok. The Chinese-owned platform had engaged constructively with regulators, offering concessions to address concerns. As a result, TikTok avoided fines entirely. X received clear deadlines. The company had 60 working days to fix the deceptive blue checkmark system. That meant either eliminating the paid badges or making absolutely clear to users that they represented subscriptions rather than verified identity. X also had 90 working days to submit a detailed action plan addressing the advertising repository and researcher access problems. That plan would be evaluated by the European Board for Digital Services. If the company failed to comply with these requirements, it could face periodic penalty payments, essentially ongoing fines, until the violations were corrected. The ball was now in Elon Musk's court. Elon Musk's reaction was immediate and incendiary. Within hours of the announcement, he posted on X calling the fine bullshit. But he didn't stop there. In a series of posts that went viral, Musk launched a full-throated attack on the European Union itself. He wrote that the EU should be abolished and sovereignty returned to individual countries. He characterized European regulators as unelected bureaucrats imposing their will on democratic societies. He claimed the fine had been levied not just against X as a company, but against him personally. Most controversially, Musk alleged that the European Commission had offered him what he called an illegal secret deal. According to his account, Brussels had suggested X could avoid the fine by agreeing to quiet censorship, moderating content according to EU political preferences without publicizing those arrangements. European officials immediately denied this characterization. They clarified that X, like other companies under DSA investigation, had been offered the standard settlement procedure. Companies can avoid fines by voluntarily offering legally binding commitments to fix violations. This is a formal, transparent process, not a secret deal. X's lawyers had explored this option, but Musk ultimately rejected it. He preferred what he called a very public battle in court. Musk's response extended beyond rhetoric. X took the extraordinary step of suspending the European Commission's official advertising account. The company accused EU regulators of manipulating advertising tools to promote their ruling against X. European officials called this retaliation and dismissed the accusations as baseless. The suspension was eventually reversed, but the move demonstrated just how personal this conflict had become. For Musk, this wasn't simply a legal dispute between a company and a regulator, it was an ideological battle. Throughout his posts, Musk framed the issue as fundamentally about censorship. He argued that European regulations were designed not to protect citizens, but to control speech. In his view, the Digital Services Act gave bureaucrats power to dictate what ideas could be expressed and which voices could be heard. The blue checkmark fine was just a pretext. The real agenda was forcing platforms to moderate content according to Brussels' political preferences. Musk positioned himself as defending not just his company, but democratic principles themselves. The world's richest man was casting himself as a resistance leader against authoritarian overreach. Within hours of Musk's posts, powerful voices in Washington joined the fight. Vice President J.D. Vance took to X to defend Musk and attack the European Union. He wrote that the EU should be supporting free speech, not attacking American companies over garbage. He characterized the fine as punishment for refusing to practice censorship. Texas Senator Ted Cruz went even further, calling the penalty an abomination and an attack on every American. Cruz demanded that President Trump impose sanctions on the European Union until the fine was reversed. Secretary of State Marco Rubio issued a formal statement describing the fine as an attack on all American tech platforms and the American people. Rubio argued that the EU was engaging in protectionism, using regulations to disadvantage U.S. companies that dominated European digital markets. He warned that the Trump administration would not tolerate what he called extraterritorial overreach by foreign governments attempting to regulate American speech. The rhetoric from Washington was remarkably unified and aggressive. Both elected officials and Trump administration appointees presented the DSA fine as a direct challenge to American sovereignty. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick connected the tech dispute directly to ongoing trade negotiations. He stated publicly that the European Union must revise its digital regulations to secure a deal aimed at reducing steel and aluminum tariffs. In Lutnick's formulation, European tech regulation wasn't just a legal matter. It was a trade barrier, similar to tariffs themselves, that justified American economic retaliation. This linkage raised the stakes considerably. What had started as a fine against one platform was now entangled with the entire transatlantic trade relationship. The European Commission responded firmly but carefully. Spokesman Thomas Regnier emphasized that the fine was about transparency obligations under the DSA, not about freedom of speech. He stated that the rules apply equally regardless of a company's country of origin. Brussels wasn't targeting American firms. They were enforcing European law within European jurisdiction. Regnier also rejected any connection between tech enforcement and trade negotiations. The Commission's position was clear. Digital regulation and trade policy are separate matters governed by separate laws and processes. European officials seemed taken aback by the intensity of the American response. What they had intended as routine regulatory enforcement had triggered a full diplomatic confrontation. On December 24th, just 19 days after the X fine was announced, the United States escalated dramatically. Secretary of State Marco Rubio issued visa bans against 5 prominent Europeans. They were now prohibited from entering American territory. Rubio characterized these individuals as radical activists who had led organized efforts to coerce American platforms into censoring and suppressing American viewpoints. He accused them of advancing censorship crackdowns by foreign states targeting American speakers and American companies. The bans represented an unprecedented step. The United States was treating European officials and civil society activists as threats to American national security. The most prominent target was Thierry Breton. He had served as European Commissioner for the Internal Market from 2019 to 2024. Breton was the principal architect of the Digital Services Act, shepherding the legislation through years of negotiation and drafting. Under Secretary of State for Public Diplomacy, Sarah Rogers called him the mastermind of the DSA. She accused Breton of using the law to threaten Elon Musk, specifically citing communications between Breton and Musk during the 2024 presidential campaign. The 4 others hit with travel restrictions were activists working on online safety issues. Imran Ahmed leads the Center for Countering Digital Hate, a research organization that has documented hate speech and misinformation on various platforms, including X. Elon Musk previously sued this organization after it published reports critical of content moderation on his platform. Annalena von Hodenberg and Josephine Ballin lead Hate Aid, a German nonprofit that provides support to victims of online harassment and hate speech. Claire Melford co-founded the Global Disinformation Index, a British organization researching the spread of false information online. The reaction in Europe was shock and fury. French President Emmanuel Macron wrote that the measures amount to intimidation and coercion aimed at undermining European digital sovereignty. He emphasized that EU regulations are democratically adopted and apply equally without targeting any specific country. Germany's Justice Ministry stated that describing anti-hate speech work as censorship misrepresents the German constitutional system. They declared that rules governing the digital space in Europe are decided in Europe, not in Washington. Breton himself responded defiantly on X. He asked whether McCarthy's witch hunt was returning, referencing the anti-communist campaigns of the 1950s when government officials were persecuted for alleged political views. He reminded readers that 90% of the European Parliament and all 27 EU member states had unanimously voted for the Digital Services Act. Breton added a pointed message to Americans: censorship isn't where you think it is. His implication was clear. The real threat to free expression was coming from Washington, not Brussels. To understand why this conflict became so explosive, we need to step back and look at the broader geopolitical context. The confrontation over X is really about something much larger: digital sovereignty. For decades, American technology companies have dominated the global digital landscape. Google controls search. Facebook, now Meta, dominates social media. Amazon leads e-commerce. Apple and Microsoft provide the operating systems and platforms. The Trump administration views this regulatory assertiveness as a direct challenge to American interests. In January 2026, the White House released a new national security strategy. The document portrayed Europe as a continent facing civilizational erasure, implying that migration and political change threatened European identity. More significantly for our story, it called for cultivating resistance to Europe's current trajectory within European nations themselves. The strategy explicitly linked trade policy, security cooperation, and support for particular political movements in Europe to American interests. This explains why the X fine became such a flashpoint. Elon Musk isn't just any tech CEO. He's become a major political player, closely aligned with President Trump. During the 2024 campaign, Musk spent heavily supporting Trump's election. After the victory, he briefly served in an advisory role focused on government efficiency. He's also intervened in European politics directly. In January 2026, Musk appeared virtually at a rally for Germany's far-right Alternative for Deutschland party. He urged attendees to move beyond Germany's historical responsibility for the Holocaust, comments that sparked widespread outrage. When European regulators fine Musk's company, Washington sees it as an attack on a key ally. When the U.S. bans European officials from entry, Brussels sees it as intimidation designed to prevent enforcement of democratically adopted laws. Both sides claim to defend freedom and sovereignty. Both accuse the other of authoritarian overreach. The result is a spiral of escalation that threatens the entire transatlantic relationship. Digital regulation has become inseparable from great power competition. Throughout this crisis, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has remained a central figure, though in ways quite different from dramatic media narratives. Reports suggesting her political collapse or vulnerability have been significantly overstated. In fact, von der Leyen's position has proven remarkably resilient. On January 23, 2026, she faced her fourth vote of no confidence since taking office. The far-right Patriots for Europe group brought the motion, primarily over controversy surrounding the EU-Mercosur trade deal rather than tech policy. The result wasn't even close. 390 members of the European Parliament voted against removing her from office. Only 165 supported the no-confidence motion. The threshold to topple the Commission requires 2/3 of votes cast and a majority of all sitting members. Von der Leyen wasn't just safe, she was decisively backed by a broad coalition spanning the center-right European People's Party, the Socialists and Democrats, Renew Europe, and the Greens. Far from being in crisis, von der Leyen has maintained an aggressive diplomatic schedule. On January 20th, she delivered a major address at the World Economic Forum in Davos, calling for European independence as a permanent guiding principle. She announced an €800 billion defense investment plan through 2030. She affirmed Europe's commitment to supporting Ukraine with €90 billion for 2026 and 2027. On January 17th, she personally traveled to Paraguay to sign the historic EU-Mercosur trade deal, culminating over 25 years of negotiations. On January 26th and 27th, von der Leyen is conducting a state visit to India, attending Republic Day celebrations as chief guest, alongside European Council President Antonio Costa. This marks the first time both top EU leaders have jointly participated in India's National Day in such capacity. The visit aims to finalize a major free trade agreement between the EU and India, what von der Leyen has called the mother of all deals. These are not the activities of a leader in collapse. They demonstrate a Commission president actively shaping European strategy on multiple fronts simultaneously. On the tech regulation dispute specifically, von der Leyen has been resolute. She and her commission have repeatedly emphasized that enforcement of the Digital Services Act is not negotiable. In her Davos speech, she spoke about Europe taking responsibility for its own security and economic future. This included defending Europe's right to regulate its own digital space according to its own democratic choices. The Commission has made clear that it welcomes dialogue with the United States on many issues, but European law will be enforced within European jurisdiction. American pressure won't change that fundamental position. Von der Leyen is betting that Europe can withstand Washington's displeasure because the EU market is too large and too valuable for American companies to abandon. At the heart of this confrontation lies a fundamental disagreement about free speech in the digital age. American critics, led by Musk and Trump administration officials, frame European regulation as censorship. They argue that governments have no business dictating what legal content platforms can host or how they present information. In this view, the marketplace of ideas should be as unregulated as possible. Bad ideas will be defeated by better ideas through open debate, not through government intervention. European regulators see it very differently. They argue that massive platforms wield enormous power over public discourse. Without transparency and accountability, these companies can manipulate information flows, amplify extremism for engagement, and create environments where misinformation thrives. The DSA's requirements aren't about controlling speech, they insist. They're about ensuring companies are honest about their practices. Making advertisers disclose who they are isn't censorship. Requiring platforms to give researchers data access isn't thought control. Prohibiting deceptive design that tricks users isn't limiting expression. Interestingly, independent legal analysts largely support the European position on these specific violations. The nonprofit Tech Policy Press noted that many DSA requirements resemble existing American laws or proposals that have garnered bipartisan support. For instance, Republican-controlled legislatures in Texas and Florida have passed laws requiring platforms to explain content moderation decisions and provide transparency. These laws have survived court challenges. The Federal Communications Commission, even under Republican leadership, has proposed similar disclosure requirements. The X fines specifically targeted 3 narrow issues. Selling verification badges while calling them verified was deemed consumer deception. Maintaining an intentionally dysfunctional advertising repository violated transparency obligations companies had agreed to follow. Blocking researcher access prevented independent study of platform impacts. None of these directly regulate what speech appears on X. Users can still post the same content regardless of these requirements. Critics of Musk's censorship narrative point out that calling these transparency rules censorship fundamentally misrepresents what the DSA actually does. Yet the broader debate continues. Musk and his supporters raise legitimate concerns about regulatory scope creep. If governments can require transparency today, what will they require tomorrow? Could content moderation obligations eventually expand to cover political speech that officials deem problematic? European regulators counter that democratic processes and judicial review provide safeguards against abuse. The DSA was adopted by elected parliaments and can be challenged in courts. This isn't authoritarian censorship, it's democratic governance applied to digital platforms. The reality is that both sides have valid concerns, and finding the right balance between platform accountability and speech protection remains one of the defining challenges of our era. So where does this standoff go from here? Multiple scenarios are possible, and each could reshape the digital landscape. First, X could comply with the requirements. The company could redesign its verification system to clearly indicate that blue checks represent paid subscriptions, not verified identity. It could fix the advertising repository to meet transparency standards. It could provide legitimate researchers with proper data access. If X does these things within the deadlines the commission set, the fine would be paid, but ongoing penalties would be avoided. Second, X could appeal to the European Court of Justice. This process typically takes several years. The company would need to make legal arguments that the commission either exceeded its authority, applied the law incorrectly, or imposed disproportionate penalties. Based on precedent from previous tech cases, European courts generally defer to commission interpretations of their own regulations, but they have occasionally reduced fines or modified requirements when they found regulatory overreach. An appeal would keep the dispute alive and uncertain for years. Third, diplomatic negotiations could produce a compromise. Despite the heated rhetoric, channels of communication between Washington and Brussels remain open. The Trump administration could use the dispute as leverage in broader trade negotiations. Europe could offer concessions on enforcement approaches in exchange for American cooperation on other issues. Musk himself could negotiate directly with European officials, potentially reaching a settlement that addresses concerns while allowing him to save face publicly. This outcome would require both sides to step back from maximalist positions. Fourth, political change in Europe could alter the landscape. Multiple EU member states face elections in 2026 and 2027. If nationalist or anti-regulation parties gain power, pressure could build to weaken or revise the DSA. Some European politicians have already questioned whether tech regulation has gone too far or been applied too aggressively. A shift in the political balance within the European Parliament or among member state governments could lead to reforms that make compliance easier for platforms. Fifth, X could attempt what some have called the nuclear option, withdrawing from the European market entirely. This seems unlikely given that Europe represents over 100 million users and significant advertising revenue, but Musk has proven willing to make financially costly decisions when he believes principles are at stake. If he decides the DSA represents an existential threat to his vision of the platform, he might calculate that losing Europe is worth preventing the spread of similar regulations globally. Such a move would be devastating for European X users and could reshape the entire European social media landscape. Regardless of how the X case resolves, this confrontation has profound implications that extend far beyond one platform or one fine. We may be witnessing the fragmentation of the global internet into distinct regulatory zones. For decades, the internet was imagined as a unified global space. A user in Paris, Palo Alto, or Panjim would access essentially the same services with the same features. But that vision is crumbling. China has long maintained its own segregated internet behind the Great Firewall. Russia has implemented increasingly strict controls. Now the transatlantic divide is producing what analysts call regulatory divergence on a massive scale. Tech companies are responding by creating region-specific versions of their platforms. Features available to American users may differ from what Europeans see. Content moderation policies vary by jurisdiction. Verification systems, advertising practices, and data handling all adapt to local requirements. This isn't just a technical adjustment. It reflects fundamentally different societal choices about the balance between freedom and safety, innovation and accountability, corporate power and democratic governance. The competition between the American and European models creates strategic opportunities for other regions. Countries like India, Brazil, Indonesia, and Nigeria represent enormous markets with hundreds of millions of internet users. They're developing their own regulatory frameworks, often blending elements from both American and European approaches. The nation that can demonstrate its model works best, enabling innovation while protecting citizens, may see its influence spread globally. This isn't just economic competition. It's a battle over whose values will shape the digital future. For other tech companies, the X case is being watched extremely closely. How Musk responds and whether Europe backs down will signal how seriously future DSA enforcement should be taken. If X successfully resists or negotiates favorable terms, other platforms may adopt similar confrontational strategies. If Europe crushes resistance and forces full compliance, companies will know that Brussels means business. Meta, Google, TikTok, and others are all calculating their own strategies based on what happens here. For ordinary users, the stakes are deeply personal. The platforms we rely on for news, communication, and community are being fundamentally reshaped by these conflicts. Whether we'll continue to have access to global conversation spaces or be increasingly confined to regional digital bubbles remains uncertain. The choices made by regulators, companies, and politicians in these disputes will determine what kind of internet exists for the next generation. This isn't abstract policy. It's about the digital spaces where we live our lives. This confrontation raises uncomfortable questions about power in the 21st century. Who actually governs our digital lives? Democratically elected governments claim the authority to set rules within their jurisdictions. Yet the platforms that shape public discourse are private companies, accountable primarily to shareholders. When Elon Musk says he's defending free speech, he's defending his right to run his company according to his principles. When the European Commission says it's protecting citizens, it's asserting government authority over corporate behavior. Historically, democratic societies have regulated media and communications. Broadcast television faced content requirements. Telephone companies operated as regulated utilities. Newspapers, while protected by press freedom, still had to follow laws against defamation and fraud. The internet disrupted these frameworks. Platforms claim to be neutral intermediaries, not publishers, and therefore not responsible for user content. But as these platforms grew to unprecedented size and influence, that argument became increasingly untenable. They make editorial choices about what content to amplify or suppress, even if those choices are made by algorithms rather than editors. The concentration of power in a small number of platforms is historically unprecedented. X, Meta, Google, and a handful of others reach billions of people. They shape what information spreads, what movements gain traction, what ideas enter public consciousness. In past eras, such influence was distributed across thousands of newspapers, radio stations, and television channels, many with local or national reach. Now, a few companies based primarily in California exercise global influence. This concentration makes the question of who controls them absolutely critical, yet the answer isn't obvious. Government control brings its own dangers. Authoritarian states use regulation to silence dissent and control information. Even democracies can overreach, using safety concerns as pretext for political censorship. The European Union points to its democratic legitimacy, its elected parliament, its judicial review as safeguards against abuse. Critics counter that bureaucratic structures can insulate decision-makers from real accountability, and regulatory processes, however democratic in theory, can be captured by special interests or used to protect incumbent powers from disruptive challengers. Some observers argue we need entirely new governance models for digital spaces. They propose treating major platforms as public utilities, subject to public interest obligations. Others advocate for interoperable systems that would allow users to switch between platforms while maintaining their networks, creating market pressure for better behavior. Still, others believe in digital commons governance, where platform rules are set by communities of users rather than either corporations or governments. These debates are just beginning, and the X versus EU confrontation demonstrates how high the stakes have become. The showdown between Elon Musk's X and the European Union represents far more than a dispute over a fine. It's a defining conflict over the future of the internet, free expression, and democratic governance in the digital age. As we've seen, both sides claim to defend fundamental principles. Brussels argues it's protecting citizens from corporate manipulation and ensuring transparency. Washington and Musk counter that they're defending free speech from government overreach. The reality is that both perspectives contain important truths and serious blind spots. The immediate future holds several critical deadlines. X has 60 working days to address the blue checkmark deception and 90 days to submit plans for fixing advertising transparency and research access. Will Musk comply, continue fighting, or attempt something more dramatic? European regulators have shown they're willing to impose periodic penalties if companies don't cooperate. American political leaders have demonstrated they'll use diplomatic and economic pressure to defend U.S. tech companies. The confrontation could easily escalate further. What's clear is that ordinary citizens are caught in the middle of a battle between powerful institutions. We rely on these platforms for connection, information, and civic participation. The rules governing them will determine what we can see, say, and organize around. These aren't technical questions for experts to resolve behind closed doors. They're fundamental choices about what kind of society we want to build. Do we prioritize corporate freedom or democratic accountability, platform neutrality or transparency requirements, global integration or national sovereignty? The answers won't come easily, and they won't satisfy everyone. But the conversation is happening now, driven by conflicts like this one. As you watch this story unfold, ask yourself what matters most to you. Should companies like X be able to operate globally with minimal oversight, trusting market competition to ensure they serve users well? Or should democratic governments set binding rules for platforms, even if that means different rules in different places? Your answer will help shape what comes next. This is Nora Flynn, and this has been Nora Flynn. If you found this analysis valuable, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next deep dive into the forces shaping our world. Leave a comment below sharing your perspective. Do you think the EU fine was justified, or does it represent regulatory overreach? Should Musk comply or continue fighting? The debate is far from over, and your voice matters. Share this video with anyone who cares about the future of free expression online. The battle for the digital public square has only just begun, and how it ends will define our era.